And it's so interesting to think there's this promise that this practice can give you something. And yet I've seen people walk down very dark paths. Maybe not because of the practice, but the practice didn't prevent it. But I'm curious for your take on how we can do this better, how we can recognize the shadow side of what we practice better and integrate the insights better. And what is some practical advice that you could give the people watching today to integrate their practice better?
The easiest thing that we try to do with our community, and I say the easiest because it's the easiest to say and it's the easiest for people to understand, and you don't need any other skills than just being a human being to do it. It's really train telling people what you think. And the reason why I say that is because it's a really scary thing to tell people what you think. It's really scary to tell them what you think about yourself. It's sometimes even scarier to tell them what you think about them. And part of training, at least for us, is the potential to not only get to know yourselves, but to get to know other people. So the risk of an individual going down a path, for example, like the one you described, it doesn't happen overnight. There are signs, just like any other sport or any other event, life event. In order to get to understand what that person's looking for, why are they switching off their emotions to be able to do that conversation? Mm-hmm. It takes a simple conversation. It's just not simple because it requires a lot of courage. So I guess that the advice is try, in the same way that you would approach a jump and do all the progressions to try to make it. I think really trying to increase your communication and your bonding with the people that are around you training, it's a nice kind of self-regulatory thing that we can all do in the community to just be a lot more open about what someone's training is and what it is not.
Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast, where we bring you the most interesting and enlightening conversations around movement practice and how you can become the most heroic version of yourself through pursuing movement that's relevant to your nature. This is a podcast that's going to feature some of the top movers in the world, some of the most amazing movement thinkers, and people from fields that are related to movement as far afield as evolutionary theory, strength and conditioning, and everything in between. So if you're interested in movement, please stick around. And if you like our work and want to support it, please consider supporting us on Patreon, because this podcast is completely listener supported. We don't want to take any advertising. We don't want to interrupt your experience of watching the show. So what really helps us get the best thinkers on, have the time to put these together, have the best quality for you guys as far as audio and video, is your support. So please consider supporting us and enjoy the rest of the show.
Hello, and welcome back to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. So, first of all, our guest this week is Kasturi Torchia. You may not have heard her name before, but I think her work is incredibly powerful and very much something that we wanted to showcase here on this podcast. Kasturi is a PhD candidate in counseling psychotherapy, and she is the founder of Esprit Concrete, which is a method that is combining Parkour and Deplacement with therapeutic modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy and psychodynamic therapy. So she has defended her thesis, but has not published it yet. We'll get into that and get into the details of how these two things come together. I was recently introduced to her by a good friend of mine, and I was very interested because obviously this is very aligned with our ideas around parkour as a form of self-cultivation, or movement practice as a form of self-cultivation. So really excited to share that with you guys. Before we get to the podcast, just a little bit of housekeeping. So many of you know that we released our retreats for 2020 recently. Return of the Source is already sold out. I'm really excited about that. We have an amazing crew coming, and we have a lot of folks coming back. It's almost half people who are coming back for a seminar for the second time. So very excited about that. We do have also our seasonal seminars, May 14th through the 17th and October 1st through the 4th, which are on sale if you'd like to get involved with one of our retreats this year, which is really the best way to experience the Evolve, Move, Play method. So our spring retreat, Awaken Your Movement, is going to be focused on really preparing the body and coming into the high energy season of summer. We're going to be seeing the beauty of the spring in Washington, the blossoms. You're going to get to do 4 days of training. You'll have 3 nights on our family property. We'll be going to Volunteer Park and Whatcom Falls and climbing the creek. And the creek run is especially cool, actually, in those spring and fall seasons because we have higher water flow. So it's quite intense and really fun. So if you're interested in that, make sure to reach out to us ASAP, get on a call, because those spots will likely move very, very fast. That's pretty much the details. If you want to check out more, we'll be a link in the description. Without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Kasturi Torchia.
Unlike a lot of people, I didn't know any of the social media stuff about it, not even the films, or I just thought stunts are stunts. And so, yeah, I had no idea what I was getting into. And so I just really, really tried it not knowing anything, which now that I think about it, I feel like I'm quite lucky, actually, because I didn't really have any expectations at all. And it was all really quite new and novel. So yeah, about 5.5 years ago.
Cool. You didn't have to worry about having to jump off buildings right away.
No, actually, Yao was my first teacher, and I was at that. I went to that class because he was teaching at my university where I was studying, and as part of the university, it was free. So I dropped in because somebody else recommended it for me, but more in terms of just there's this class you may like. They didn't actually train themselves, so they just knew me and thought they know what that is. 1 + 1 = 2. So I turned up and he asked me, have you ever tried parkour? He was teaching with PKG at the time. Have you ever tried parkour before? And I said, what's that? So it was quite hilarious. But yeah, so turned up, really thoroughly enjoyed it. But now in hindsight, when I think about it, I think I thoroughly enjoyed what he also brought to the session, and his take on it. And for me, as soon as I did it, my mind was just blown. I was just like, I see therapy here. Like it was pretty a very visceral change, I think. And then I just thought, okay, I feel like I think I said to him after the class, I feel like I want to do this forever now. But I didn't even know what this was. So yeah.
Excellent. So you said you were in university at the time. You were in University for Clinical Psychology?
Counseling psychology. So yeah, I was on my doctorate, and I was at the time on my doctorate, people were starting to think about what their thesis was about. I didn't have a topic yet. I was quite behind on choosing a topic. And I didn't really have anything that kind of I felt like I could immerse myself in. So I never really used to associate myself with academia too much. I kind of found it a way to do the thing that I loved, which was working with people in a capacity that made sense to me and that I felt aligned with. Therapy made sense to me because I wanted to know about me and my history and all the whys about my family and stuff like that. So I think I got into it that way. So whenever I heard research, I used to kind of panic because I didn't know what I wanted to research or what research really was about. And then once I started getting to training a little bit more, and I had ups and downs with my training, the fact that I just innately saw processes that parallel training with what they were teaching me it is to practice therapy, I kind of thought, can I do something with this? And Yao and I spoke for hundreds of hours before we even came up with what I wanted to study. And then we honed it even more with my supervisor because it was too broad. And I ended up doing a grounded theory study on lack of progression in parkour. And it resulted in a model that's kind of psychodynamically informed, but it's a multimodal model that allows us to create a kind of longitudinal understanding of an individual and how they process hurdles in general, and how that can be applied to their movement hurdles in order to kind of simultaneously unblock struggles that they go through. So it's a very process-driven thing. I did passed my Viva not too long ago, but I've got quite a lot of amendments because I have to just grow everything. So although I don't have too many core changes, I need to flesh it out a bit more. But I'm currently 5 months pregnant. So
Congrats.
now we have, thank you. No, most people don't know yet. But yeah, so we're juggling a few things, but at some point this year that will get finished and then people will have access to it. But that's what we use at Esprit Concrete to inform our work.
Yeah, was your partner?
Yowers, yes. And he's also the co-owner of Esprit Concrete.
So he's your partner and your partner. He's all the things.
He's my partner in a lot of different ways. And just because of different skills that we have, it's also taken a while for us to learn how to work together. So it's been interesting to also, you know, to know that you've got somebody who completely gets what you're doing, but at the same time maybe does it in such a different way that you need to work through the clashes. So it's quite nice because our process mirrors our work. So it's quite fun, but also very challenging sometimes. Yeah.
You said you passed something, but I didn't catch it, or maybe it was some British.
Just when you finish your doctorate or your PhD, you have to defend your research. So you can pass it with no amendments or minor changes, or you can pass, or you cannot pass it, or you can pass it with some like time-consuming changes. So given that I'm pregnant and also there's a lot that I can now elaborate on, not having any kind of word limit or anything, I've got quite a bit that I want to do to it before I submit the final thing, which is available to everyone. So yeah. But it's just a nice marker for me because obviously
your thesis, but it hasn't been published.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so your thesis is basically on what I heard was your thesis is essentially the mental thing that happens when you're plateauing or not able to progress in parkour, and then how you deal with that process.
So this is where I feel like I get really boring, but if I don't explain it fully, then I also get lost. So the model is like a picture, so it's on one page, and it goes through getting people to think about what they came into parkour looking for, what they eventually maybe gained, but also maybe lost, paradoxically lost from their training experience or their training style. How that resulted in some kind of coping mechanism kicking in that either kept them in the discipline or moved them out in different ways. So whether that's from something small like repetitive injury, or if that's actual quitting, there are different styles that develop. And the model kind of shows how the start to the end links in and maintains itself, and how that mirrors somebody's natural style of coping with issues that they face, challenges. So we call it in psychological speak a kind of longitudinal model that we can use to formulate clients. So if a psychologist was to start working specifically with ADD, parkour, free running, they would be able to use this conceptualization with the client to better understand the processes, but without isolating it as being only sports focused, because the parallel with how they cope in relationships, how they cope with work, how they cope with other things, mirrors it directly.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm not a therapist or deeply educated in psychology, but I have come across different psychological schools of thought through different years, and one of them that I'm familiar with or somewhat familiar with is cognitive behavioral therapy. And essentially that's what I understand about it is a lot of it has to do with exposure therapy, and then changing your mental processes so that you learn how to manage anxiety and become more courageous to overcome the things that are limiting you. And as I started reading a little bit about it, it struck me that that has in a lot of ways like a kind of a mental parallel to what we saw with parkour, right? So I started jokingly calling parkour motor behavioral therapy, right?
Okay.
Physically acting out the process of exposing yourself to something that is challenging, potentially fear or anxiety inducing, frustration inducing, and then creating a process that allows you to overcome that. So that was one of the reasons why I was attracted to having a conversation with you, is because I thought this was really interesting. And our orientation with Evolve Move Play is really about the idea that fundamentally movement practices exist. The thing that keeps people coming back to movement practices, whatever movement practice it is it somehow allows a transformation in their self that's meaningful to them and that is transferable to life. But often we don't actually focus on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think a lot about how to get better at the Kong vault, but we don't think about how we make the Kong vault work better to help us be better at everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like that's very aligned with what you, the work that you're doing with Esprit Concrete. So I'm curious whether do you see the same parallel? Are you using cognitive behavioral therapy? Like you mentioned psychodynamic therapy. I'm just, if you could give me a little bit more.
Yeah.
That would be great.
So by trade, I don't like officially calling myself counseling psychologist without saying pending post Fiverr, because that's just more accurate. But even as a therapist, because I'm already a qualified therapist, so if we just go with that, the idea is that as a counseling psychologist trainee, you work multimodally.
Mm-hmm.
But you work with whichever model, I guess, not only are you competent in, but your client needs.
Yeah.
So the parallels that you're making with the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy, I think I would call it the easiest way for us to draw a parallel between a problem-solving scenario
mm-hmm.
in parkour with a very visual aspect to it, where you can see all those steps and you can follow them through. And in that way, that situation mirrors it really, really well. So I can totally relate to what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
What I think is a little bit different with Esprit Concrete is that the Esprit Concrete method is an approach that is more linked to a mindset for conceptualizing the person's processes, mm-hmm. rather than a methodology you sign up to. So it's not paralleled in the sense that CBT has its strengths and vulnerabilities. Psychodynamic has its strengths and vulnerabilities. Esprit Concrete uses whichever therapeutic model best suits the client.
Sure. And
that is kind of dependent on what the client feels, but also what professional judgment I put in, or whoever the therapist would be. Yes, so in that sense, how I make sense of the people who work with me, mm-hmm. And how I try to help them make sense of the people who work with us, is really fundamentally dependent on who is in front of me. Yeah. So some people kind of want to or need to look way past the present and be a lot less solution focused or problem solving focused, and think more about the relational dynamics that they need to work on in order to best live comfortably within their own relationships, within work relationships, within their systems. So if it's very systemic, there are systemic approaches that will, for me, tap in a lot more to psychodynamic theory that we will bring to the front. And as a result, the Esprit Concrete method that we deliver to that person will mirror the needs that they have. So we would use a lot more object-related analogies. We would use a lot more in-depth questioning of the hows. We would use the guided discovery a lot further to go back to the root sort of triggers of our defenses than we would with somebody, for example, who comes in and says, I can't physically get to work because I'm that anxious.
Yeah.
I want to be able to go back to work by this date. In which case, that's very classically useful for us to use a CBT sort of methodology. But the Esprit Concrete model will base its work around my grounded theory model, longitudinal model, which would have space for not the modality we work, but just a more comprehensive understanding of a sport and psychological longitudinal formulation for that individual.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different because although the Esprit Concrete method is an intervention, mm-hmm. It's an intervention that changes the look of it, depending on who we're working with. And therefore, it doesn't refute or suggest that it's better or completely different to any other therapeutic model. It's just bringing them together in a different way, using a very different medium, because the medium is objects and how we overcome them. And the model in itself doesn't exist yet. So as far as I know, I'm not sure, but I think that it's the first grounded theory study of.
So can you clarify the term grounded theory?
So it's a theory generation, which means I did a set of interviews that then extrapolated core processes from that people were undergoing who experienced the process of either quitting or lack of progression. Okay. And using those processes and a detailed analysis of that, qualitative analysis of it, I created a conceptualization and a model that I then tested with the following interviews that I did to create a theory.
Okay.
And the theory will develop hopefully over the years that I do it, if I continue. But the initial theory is what my doctorate is on. The model is just the visual representation of what the theory I'm suggesting is. Mm-hmm. And there definitely wasn't a theory like that in counseling psychology, but there also wasn't necessarily too many theories that took a really longitudinal approach. So from lifespan approach in sport, because sport has always been quite outcome driven. So even though it recognizes the value of the psychologist's perspective, it kind of still was very heavily driven by the fact that we need you to attain this, that, and the other, and you need to attain this, that, and the other. So it starts, at least from what I have seen and what I've come to know, it doesn't start as far back as childhood, for example. It's not very preventative in the way that it's been modeled.
So psychology in general?
Sports psychology.
Yeah. Okay.
And now the movement is a lot more holistic. It's moving a lot more towards integrating sports psychology with other disciplines. So for me, it made total sense to use the efficiency of sports psychology with the depth that you can get from counseling psychology that really looks at the person in all its environments.
Yeah.
And combining the two through this, as you said, really powerful visceral experience of art du déplacement, parkour or free running.
Yeah. So, so just to kind of replay back to you what I heard, and hopefully, make it clear for everybody. Sports psychology tends to be focused basically on, like, if I'm an athlete, say a soccer player or football player, as you guys would say over there, and I am struggling maybe with my corner kicks. I have a lot of anxiety with my corner kicks. So I'll come to you as a sports psychologist, and your goal will be to change that acute symptom now. And the depth of that analysis won't necessarily be looking at the full lifespan. And then we're not going to be necessarily looking at how the practice of soccer impacts the rest of my life. Is that sort of what you're saying in sports psychology has tended to focus on?
Yes, and I think also the athlete has tended to focus on because of the system they're in. So when they go to a sports psychologist, they want that sports psychologist to help them alleviate that anxiety, because with that anxiety, they can't be proficient for their team.
Yeah.
But if there's a normalization of the fact that, okay, are you perhaps anxious with other things in the same way? Or what is it specifically about this that's generating this anxiety? Sometimes you can extrapolate something fundamental that that person has now sort of created a habit with or formed a defense for, that if that's worked on, the likelihood that he may then get anxious with goal kicks and just transferring one anxiety to another sort of reduces. But it's really about then just changing the pattern of thinking, both for the professional and for the club, but also for the individual. And just allowing that maybe things take a little bit more time. Maybe they're not as instantaneous, but over time, we save money, we save energy, we save things that are just because we're being more preventative rather than just curative of a problem.
Yeah. So this is something that kind of hits on my personal little passion, I guess, right now, and also what really attracted me to have this conversation with you, because I think it's interesting that, you know, you're marrying basically psychology that is very performance oriented with psychology that is sort of person oriented, right? Like life oriented. And it seems like in a lot of ways, and then you're marrying that with parkour ADD, right? Which is this very, in some ways, it's a very strange phenomenon in the kind of sport world that I think actually parallels a lot of this distinction. The way that I've been thinking about this in my own head is a distinction that's used in Japanese martial arts between do and jitsu. Are you familiar with this?
No, but I think I remember listening to a podcast that you did, maybe with Thomas, where you mentioned it and then you were also talking about gi, I think. I'm not a martial arts sort of connoisseur, but I then Googled it. So I have a sort of some idea of it. But yeah, thanks to your podcast.
Yeah, so I mean, I will just lay it out real quickly, but do basically is the Japanese version of the word Dao, which is in Dao De Ching. It means way, right? And jitsu basically just means technique, right? So you can have a jitsu of carpentry or a jitsu of, you know, computer programming. Traditionally, a lot of the martial arts started as jitsu in Japan anyways. They were oriented primarily towards essentially being professional skills of a warrior class. When those professional skills were no longer really necessary in the world, right? When, you know, swordsmanship didn't matter that much because you had guns, people wanted to continue practicing it. And then many of these arts started to change their name from jujitsu to judo, from kenjutsu to kendo, etc. And some of them became very sport oriented, which is a little bit different. But the general idea of the do was that it was about how it impacted you as a person. So even though practicing swordsmanship may no longer be highly relevant as a life skill or as a professional skill, they found that there was something in it that changed who they were, and that this was of great value to them. And so these arts were retained with this perspective. If we look at the Chinese martial arts, there's been this tradition of Dao as very interlaced with the martial arts, perhaps even more so, and for a very long time, because what are called the internal martial arts, Tai Chi, Agua, and Jingyi, are actually Taoist martial arts. They are deeply interwoven historically with Taoist practices of meditation and ritual and alchemy and everything else. They understood, and Gung Fu, the term Gung Fu, the Chinese term Gung Fu, actually means good work, so approximately. It doesn't mean martial art. But the idea is that when we practice these things, they change us. And so I just read some article about this. I can't remember where, but it crystallized this thought that essentially parkour developed as a Dao, right? The guys who started it, they didn't really build it to put it on YouTube or to become professionals or to do anything. They built it because they needed an outlet to cultivate themselves in a situation that was often not very promising. But then when it was spread to the rest of the world, we only saw the jitsu aspect of it. But there's something about parkour that's attracted millions of people now to practice it, despite the fact that there's, you know, traditionally not very many coaches available, not very many professional opportunities available. And when you talk to people who practice it, they talk about how it has this life impact on them. And that's not unique to parkour, right? If you talk to surfers or jiu-jitsu players or anybody else, what I found is that anyone who is deeply devoted to a practice for a long time and gets a lot out of it, when you ask them why they do it, it tends not to be technical. It tends to be temperamental or character, right? It's because it changes who they are.
And I think that's a nice kind of parallel to draw for why I say Esprit Concrete method mainly uses art du déplacement with parkour technique. Because the parkour has, in our view, at least at Esprit Concrete, become manualized in a way where it's really efficient at teaching movement. You know, and we've got, you know, Stefan Vigru and all the rest to thank for this, but it's it's easy to be able to break down the movement if you learn it and if you train it, and also if you practice teaching it, for people who just want the movement to get the movement. And then if there's something in that person that perhaps you sense or they sense that is searching for a little bit more, then you kind of need to go into the way that you're talking about. And for me, the way that I've experienced Art du Déplacement being transmitted just inherently has a way about it that I found was something I felt was only obvious if you were seeking it. Mm-hmm. And if you weren't seeking it, sometimes it didn't actually feel that different. So I never had in my mind a kind of clear definition of what was what, except I knew that kind of parkour, I felt everyone could move it. Mm-hmm. And when I went and spent time with the Yamakasi, I felt like not everyone necessarily needed to or wanted to experience that way. Mm-hmm. And I guess the mindset that they were maybe sharing, or and I love the fact that it's so versatile, which is the same as therapy. So as I said before, somebody can come and say, I just want to learn how to fix this, and then I know I'll be happy. And that's their prerogative, that's their journey, that's what I can help them with, whereas somebody else will say, well, there's just something in me, I'm fine, I've got this, but this just feels like there's something missing. And then that requires a completely different approach. But the medium looks the same if you film it on camera. We're both sitting in a room and we're talking to one another. And with the movement, it's the same. If you see people who practice ADD moving, it doesn't look that different in the movements. You see someone doing parkour free running, it doesn't look that different, but it's all in the person and what it means for them. That interpretation was really fascinating for me.
That's interesting. I'm curious about that because I guess I've drawn the distinction in a different place. I draw the distinction more in the moment that it left France. And I may be wrong about this because you're much closer to that origin than I am, right? You've met a lot more or spent a lot more time with the people, right, who are part of this. But my perception of it was that, David and the Yamak and all those people who came together in the beginning, they were cultivating something, and they each had their own little version of it, and it could be very different, right? Like, Stefan has written about the anger that he was kind of driving the training that he was doing with David, and then that very much changed when he trained with Williams. Mm-hmm. So they had their own visions, right? And they had different ways that were happening. Mm-hmm. But it seems like that beginning was very way focused, very Tao focused, and then I saw the kind of the Jitsu entering, or the Tao being lost, let's say, as it translated to being shared by video. Because in video, we can only see the physical. We can't really experience the psychology behind it very much. And I think there's
I think the group dynamic or the group focus there is what interested me. So in all honesty, I've never spoken to David Bell. So I hesitate really to talk too much about his perspectives because I would have heard it from other people. Sure. And I don't know him. So from what I've heard, there was a kind of, follow me, this is what I'm doing, kind of approach. Yeah. And from a psychologist's point of view, from a therapist's viewpoint, there's a certain individualism to that allows people who can keep up to keep up, or people who can't to keep up when they can and then find their own way.
Yeah.
Whereas the thing that I found that Williams, Chow, Yan, Laurent, mainly those four, but even, more recently when I met Malik, mm-hmm. what they share in common, I think, was that underlying it, there was a desire for each one of them to keep the connection between them, so that somehow there was always a coming back together. And from what I've heard, there was a certain sort of chasing of David. I've heard it's quite difficult to get in touch with him, and so I think it is a way. Yeah. But I think maybe as a psychologist, there's sort of autonomy and then collectivism, and where does that all fit in? And then competition. Why are you training? What are your motivations? And there's just a communal motivation that just came across to me much stronger with the 4 yamak that I mentioned than with what I've heard from David. But then again, I've never trained with him, so I don't know. But that's also from my experience of just different countries and how people train just parkour. There was, for a while when I first found parkour, my own stuff was being brought up, in that I felt like, because it was so easy to see the, how did you call it, the techniques?
The jitsu, yeah.
The jitsu. I got completely consumed by the jitsu.
Yeah.
I became like obsessed with, you know, how good can I be? How fast can I be that good? You know, and I don't even know why, because rationally I knew I found this when I was 28 or something like that. You know, my career is actually this thing, which I love.
Yeah.
You know, I am not trying to be an athlete, but there was something about my ego that was brought up because it was so thrilling, and there was a lot of unprocessed stuff that I had. So I stuck to that physical and that technique. So when I found the yamak who allowed my ego to kind of run free and let me really fall on my face with it, you know, then I was like, well, they knew that's going to happen and I didn't. What am I missing? And that's when I kind of found that actually, okay, these movements exist, but if you find a way to understanding why you're looking for those movements and what the movements are giving you, then you get a whole different experience of this thing. And I because I connected with that idea more with Esprit Déplacement than my parkour teachers, I naturally associate the way more with parkour teaching, that with Esprit Déplacement teaching than parkour. But I don't mean to say that there isn't the way driving parkour. I just mean in terms of how it's commercialized. I haven't found the commercialization affect Esprit Déplacement the same way, for a various number of reasons. You know, they didn't self promote as much. There wasn't that much media. A lot of things are just organic. You know, parkour, as you said, it went on TV and then it boomed. It has media. It has following. And what I'm noticing with the younger generation, even the people who, you know, we train now and the younger kids, it's becoming more and more clear that the movement is what they're chasing. In the same way that they would chase movement if they went to gymnastics or they went to running or they went anywhere else. And they're not always looking for anything more. And that's okay too. That's another way.
I find that interesting. What it seems to me is that the sustained practice, though, is always the practice that has the meaning embedded in it, right? Like, I don't think you find many 35-year-olds who have been practicing for 10 plus years who are still only movement focused.
Absolutely. I think that depth is what I call the why, the intentionality of what you do. Different people ask that question at different time points, but at some point, if you want to stay connected to something, you have to look internally for why you're doing what you're doing. And often that is much deeper. So, and as part of my model, that's what the seeking is about. If you can understand what you're looking for in this thing, anything, no matter what it is, then you get a better sense of how to manage disappointment when you're not quite getting it. More curious into why are you looking for that in the first place? You know, if you had something else, would you stop looking for that? There's just a lot more questions that open up when you do think, why am I here? You know, which is not something at all that I would have invented. It's what we probably all ask ourselves, you know. But that existential question, it fascinates me for intrinsic motivation. You know, it fuels our work with it, at least.
Yeah, there's that aspect of what motivates and what gives meaning over the long term. That's the thing that I'm deeply interested in, right? You know, I'm 38 now. You know, I was lucky enough in a lot of ways to have, you know, maybe just enough physical talent and be early enough in the development of it that I got to kind of like break a lot of things first in my community. It's never necessarily the very best, but I got to have some kind of, you know, landmarks, benchmarks that I got to set out in the development of the community. And I remember at one point, one of my 11-year-old students came out and did this swing that it took me 2 years to do. And it was just this recognition that like, the physical achievements are ephemeral, right? they like, even if you do something that will last 30 years and nobody else will do it, you're not going to be able to do it again necessarily, right? Or probably not in 10 years. So if you attach too much to that external, it's like you're going to burn out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to compete in parkour at that time, and my body was just breaking down. And it was like, I can continue pushing for these goals, or I can look at this as something that I can do for my life. And is it that meaningful? Is it that, and if it is, how do I orient myself around that, around the meaning? And I think, so back to the idea of the Jitsu versus the Tao, it seems to me that there's certain arts, certain practices that become very Tao focused, and certain arts that become very Jitsu focused. And it's like the Jitsu, they end up, you talk to someone who does jujitsu, which is, it's very Jitsu focused. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's just about the techniques, right? And you ask them why they do that, and they'll always tell you some reason that has to do with character, right? Because it makes me stronger, it helps me deal with my aggression, it gives me community, it gives me all these things that are valuable to me. It's never really about the technique that they're practicing, right? It's like if you went and talked to somebody who is doing surfing, you'd hear similar reasons. And so it's like, well, but the jiu-jitsu guys are not oriented towards doing that, right? But then you go to the Tao, right? Aikido, and they're oriented towards self-development, but often they've lost track of something real. And it's like jiu-jitsu, because you really struggle and because it's chaotic, I think is fundamentally a better grounds for self-cultivation than a very scripted, very compliant Aikido match. And it's like, I'm interested in something that marries these two. And it seems to me that parkour auto déplacement is a very interesting thing, because when it's you and the obstacle, it's very real, but it gives lots of space to be oriented towards how it's changing you. And I think it gives us a potential to extract those lessons and begin to see how we balance that, not just within this practice, but within other practices as well.
Yeah, and I think that I don't really like the term psychologically minded, but I feel like if you have dialogues with yourself, if you search yourself, if you kind of you're up for that, mapping yourself out a little bit, then sometimes that's a self-discovery and a process that just happens organically.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes there are people who don't really realize that they could benefit from that, or that they maybe even want to do that. And maybe it's really scary to see more than just a jump.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we feel like we can make a difference with this approach, because it's guided, and the custody of that decision is shared between whoever they're working with and themselves, until they get to own it back and then see the movement in a way that may be a bit scarily insightful to themselves, but actually manageable. And so it's a very opt-in process.
Mm-hmm.
So initially, when we first started Esprit Concrete, it was an absolute nightmare to understand how consent fitted into this, because you're trying to make it in something where there are quite a lot of classes already of parkour, active déplacement, free running, and you want people to come, so it has to look like a movement class.
Yeah.
But you also want to work the self-development angle, because you have to try this approach you're creating.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to agree to it. But if you tell them it's therapy, they won't come, because they don't want to do therapy. And we had this massive dilemma that lasted like a year, and maybe even a year and a half, and we've only been open 3 years. And we had some really hard experiences that allowed us to connect with what it could be as an option, but what it also didn't have to be. So now the classes are really anything anyone who comes to them wants from them. If you're looking for something that is more, way orientated, you'll get it. If you're looking for pure technique, you'll get it. But subtly within the way we teach, we propose every now and again, depending on how ready we perceive people to be, to just think one layer below what they may do. Because like you said, we don't believe that if you're purely movement focused, you'll stay in movement lifelong. And our aim is kind of to keep people active and healthy and connected for us forever, for their forever.
Yeah.
So it's a fine balance between, definitely having agenda ourselves because we have a mission, as a company, as an organization, as a method, but also respecting that other people's missions are not the same.
Yeah.
And they don't have to align themselves with anything when they come to us. They just need to know that there's a possibility that we may ask a question they wouldn't have otherwise been asked. And then they have the right to shut that down. So the thing that you were talking about in terms of how can that jump change you, I think that sometimes it's taken a bit for granted that people just make those links.
Yeah.
And people make those connections. And actually, even as somebody who studied psychology, it's a really complicated process. Like, even if you make the link, what does it mean and what do I do with it? It's quite complicated for a lot of people. And I think sometimes you can be really put off by a sport and exit it because you just maybe didn't quite understand something that happened. And for athletes, that's quite important just for retention as well. But also just for lay people, connotations like parkour is dangerous.
Yep.
Well, it's not dangerous if you understand how exactly you got into that situation that made you feel vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sometimes because there is an inherent kind of solid understanding that parkour is so much more than movement, I found that sometimes we forget that a lot of people teach it just as movement. And it's not because we say, we can be stronger together, that somehow this makes us together in that process. I guess, in a recent, interview I did with this business school, I just said, we blow things up to make them so obvious that then when it's really minute, you can recognize it because you're like, oh, I've seen that before. And I felt like in classes, sometimes I had questions about myself of why do I keep doing this that were just not answered by physical progressions. I was just stuck, and it actually had nothing to do with the physical progression.
Yeah.
So I think in the martial arts point of view, maybe in the martial arts that are thinking a bit more about the way, maybe the questions help somehow to guide you to think about the processes or your own kind of reality. But if it happens in a bubble, as you said, it's not real. Mm-hmm. So the fact that, we're outside, we're interacting with people, we are using confrontation of being kicked off an estate to understand how do we react to confrontation? How do we unravel that? What was our response? Was it to shy away? Was it to fight back? Yeah. How would that help us? How would that cost us? We find that really fun, and people still learn how to do a con, so why not do both?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately they help each other, right? Like over the last few years, I've been incorporating more and more mindfulness practices into my work. And initially as a movement teacher, that's kind of, it's like, am I asking something weird of my students? But, once you start to dig into it and recognize it, it's like, well, if you have a concentration practice helps you concentrate when you're doing a jump, which makes you more successful at the jump. If you have like a metta practice where you're practicing loving kindness, like if you can be more loving and kind toward yourself when you're frustrated and doing something, you'll actually recover your mindset more quickly and be able to do it. So we can see the physical really easy, but the psychological is very often the limiting piece. And this is something that we think is just incredibly important to understand. Like when someone, we've created this model where it's like, if somebody has a problem in their application of a skill, you can imagine that they may not even be aware of it. Do they have awareness, right? So awareness is first. And then there's the level of like logical understanding, right? I get what my body, or I can describe what my body's supposed to do, right? And then there's the ability to technically embody that. And then there's the emotional regulation to do it when you need it, right? So you may know what you need to do. You may understand how it's supposed to go. You may have the physical capacity, the strength to do it. That's the other piece. You have to have the physical qualities, right? So you can have the coordination, but if you're just not strong enough, you're just not strong enough. And then even if you're strong enough, you understand it, you've got the skills. If you're scared, you won't do it, right? And so being able to understand emotional regulation is actually critical to our performance as an athlete. So we can look at it that way. And then we can look at it the other way, which is ultimately the sport is a small part of your life. So how do you get more out of it, right? Within sport, as a generalist, right? I do martial arts and I do dance and I do parkour and I do all these things, strength training, different martial arts. I'm always interested in that question of transfer of training. And that's a huge question, right? In learning theory. But we can think about that more broadly. It doesn't have to be, does my throwing translate from soccer, from football, American football to baseball? It's like, does the courage to do the jump transfer from my parkour practice to office politics, right?
Yeah.
And
I think there's a really nice push in the UK, but around the world. But Switch the Play, I think it's called. So they do quite a lot of work on transitioning athletes, and even within my own research, it's incredible how, like so many other researchers have seen, identity forms so fast, right? We want to feel like we belong. We want to fit in. It's really healthy for us to know how to fit in as well as how to stand out and know what we contribute individually. But that kind of gets us wrapped into having sometimes multiple identities. So we have these sporting identities that form, or we have training identities. In my thesis, I call it the training self. And the interesting thing is that often what we believe or expect from our training selves is so different from our true selves that we begin to encourage these splits unconsciously, just because the way that we train or what we do within a sporting context is so different from our everyday or our normal. So for me, I was really interested in how do we actually keep a more integrated sense of self through sport, just more generally, but I used the medium of ADD parkour. Because actually, if we started from that viewpoint, so if we actually, some of the recommendations in my thesis is if we actually started by having an open discussion about who are you really when you're entering this team at 13, and how do you process things at that age, how can we then tailor your training to make sure that when you exit, you're either growing the stuff that's helpful or you're discarding the stuff that's not. And that way, when you transition out of sport, you've lost your job, maybe, but you haven't lost all the other stuff. Directly, you're primed with enough self-confidence to understand you're just going to cut and paste that into another situation. And that, for me, was what was missing from sports psychology. Because a lot of the time when you were doing the assessments, although it can seem very holistic, it seemed much less holistic and integrated than what I felt it could be. And for me, that's really interesting because we start before the problem. Because we don't start before that sporting identity forms, or we don't start with, this is my life now, this is all I've become. Because the understanding, as you said, that sport is just the small part, and then what other parts do you have? They're already there from the beginning. Even in how we formulate, even in how we coach. And I think that's a tricky one, because when you go to a soccer field, for example, we were just walking the other day and we saw this soccer match, and we're watching the football, and the culture was so obvious, and Yao and I were just literally spectating. It was a Sunday and we were like, this is a show, we were watching this team play, and it was just in a local park, and it was incredible, the level of competitiveness, the language, the vulgarity that was coming out of it, but everyone was on board because that's the culture that matches them. And yet to us, we were just sitting there thinking, you do this for fun? Like we couldn't understand, But at the same time, we were just saying how fascinating it is, how do you maintain yourself not like that in an environment like that because you want to play football? And so understanding, how you keep your own kind of person whole in an environment. And if you normalize the fact that you can be that in that culture, the culture also changes over time. So longitudinally speaking, it's quite interesting to imagine, what will it look like? What will sport look like in 20 years now that more people are more focused on transition, on adaptability, on identity, being more integrated rather than split? Because I think it's definitely going to be a helpful discussion to have if it's not such a separate thing, real life and sport.
Well, it's interesting because if we look at the history of sport, right, the orientation of sport initially is much more around the cultivation of individuals than it is around the winning of the team, right? Competition means to strive together. That's I believe, Greek the word, right? Or Latin. I think it's Greek. It means to strive together, and it was in contrast to war. So sport was something that you did with people in your polis, in your city state, to prepare yourself so that you could go to war, because war was very common, right? So I want to, if we're in the same city state, I want to compete with you so that we both get really strong and really capable. But I don't want to compete with you in such a way that I break you or you break me, because I'm going to need you in that shield.
Yeah.
When we're fighting Sparta. And if we, like recently I've been reading a little bit about the origins of a lot of the modern sports like gymnastics and yawn and the British sports that all came out of the boarding school systems and that stuff. So, the British said the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, right? The idea being that the games that the British had developed were important not for the game itself, but because they developed the character of these young men that they could then go and succeed on the battlefield, right? And it seems like somehow that's gotten lost over time as, I always hesitate when I invoke capitalism because, there's so much negativity towards capitalism. And I think it's very valuable in certain ways, but as sport has become very capitalist, right, and has become oriented towards winning in order to make money, in order to sell products, sell entertainment, a lot of that idea of sport as a place where people self-cultivate has disappeared, it seems like. And then at the same time, more and more of our physical culture has been gobbled up by the sport pyramid, right? So almost none of the people who are engaged in soccer or football or whatever at third grade or first grade are going to go on and be professionals, or high school, right? Secondary school.
Yeah.
And yet the orientation of the whole system seems to be mostly about finding the people who are. And even those who are, the average career in American football is 2.5 years, right? So 2.5, right? There's a lot of life left after that.
Yeah.
And when we cultivate the system in this way, it seems like we're missing something tremendous. And I think that's actually part of why parkour was so appealing as it came out, was that it provided a space where people could get outside of that meat grinder in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think that's why I really like the fact that so I started training outside. That was how I started. Some people obviously start training inside and then transition. And for me, it really helped me feel comfortable and own my space in public. But also it made me aware of how lucky we are in the UK that there is also, or at least in London, sorry, I shouldn't say the UK, but in London, that there is a certain open-mindedness sometimes that I think I used to take for granted. And then there's also a very big shift towards privatization and the mindset that follows privatization. And it's very segregating.
Yeah.
And so when I first went to a parkour park, I was fascinated, and I thought, well, this is really cool because this is like always there, and it's specifically for the things that we train. So there's a consistency to the physicality of training that you can gain, and you can really hone those skills.
Yeah.
But in terms of normalizing practicing parkour and making it a norm, a social norm, I really, really feel like it draws back from that to a certain degree, because we don't yet have an overly privatized system. And although capitalism is everywhere, and Lord knows we're very heavily involved in it, the consumerist kind of aspect to parkour is something that I think we could potentially move away from as organizations if we keep the inherent kind of let's work together mindset, because the discipline is so orientated to getting stronger together.
Yeah.
So the fact that we are all private companies makes total sense for the environment we live in, because there is no funding for us.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that there wasn't a national governing body at the time when people first started, and having a private company was a way for you to do what you wanted to do. And if that was parkour, brilliant. So you were creating these spaces. But Esprit Concrete also tries very heavily to secure a certain percentage of its budget from grants that come from the government every year, so that we know that the state and the community are paying for us to be out there,
Mm-hmm.
teaching these guys to move in their streets, so that we try to keep the capitalist side of things a little bit at bay, just for integration, really, for normalization, not just of mental health stigma, but also freedom of practice, the ability to show people we can use their space and not ruin it.
Yeah.
The other opportunity of also, maybe people will ruin it, but we can also self-manage that, because in our discipline we have certain things we believe in, certain values we believe in. Not everyone, but the people who do, they have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite different that way to other sports that I've seen. It has a potential for self-regulation that's quite powerful,
Yeah.
if it's seen as a way.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I'm really sort of against people pushing things down my throat. So I don't go around, promoting the way. That's not usually my style. But now that we're talking about it, people may disagree because I talk about my work a lot. But I kind of feel like if you are new and you're a sport that just started, we've got the potential to do it a bit differently to how it was done before, which is why I was really happy when I started working with Parkour UK, because for us, Eugene Minogue and everybody else at Parkour UK, they work so heavily to get us a seat at the table nationally, that now we have a really organic opportunity to put all these novel links that we're making, with longevity, with transition, with integrated identities, from a duty of care point of view, from a coaching point of view, from a transmission point of view, even from a structural point of view. So PKG are, working now with spaces, natural spaces, to make them parkour friendly. There's a lot of initiative here for this sport to stay quite different, in that it doesn't happen separate to life.
Yeah.
It kind of is life. Whether people buy into it or not doesn't really matter. The fact that we have the ability to make that a possibility is really remarkable, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think parkour is a fascinating social phenomenon, and it has, I think everyone in any discipline that you love, there's always a tendency to want to fetishize it, right? So I always try to place it in context and say, well, you can see very similar things in skateboarding and snowboarding and surfing and whatever. But it does seem that that due to the point at which it arose, and maybe the fact that it's something that you can just do with your body in any space, it has some opportunities that are really unique. And this idea of the parkour philosophy, this idea of seeing people like yourself, like myself, like other people talking about the idea that it's not just the physical things, right? I don't, maybe I'm missing it, but I don't see that conversation as much, as prominently necessarily having happened, say, in the rise of skateboarding in the 1980s. And so I do think there's a really cool opportunity for us to kind of, this is just a thought that occurs to me, but let's say that there's a predominant system of sport, like there's a culture of sport, and that culture of sport, I think in a lot of ways, this is a thesis that I've been playing with, and I don't have, it's like worthy of like studying on like a book level, but I don't have the time or resources to do it. But it looks to me like a lot of the current sport culture that we had developed during the rise of nationalism in Europe, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at Jan's gymnastics, it's very much not just about gymnastics; it's about Germanness. And it's about the claim that the Germans are like essentially the people who reflect the ancient Greek heritage, because the Enlightenment had made everyone really fond of the Greeks and that Greek heritage, but they didn't want to attribute the Greek heritage to actual brown-skinned Greeks. They wanted to attribute it to blonde Aryan people like themselves. And they wanted to claim those games for themselves. And so gymnastics, is obviously the term comes from Greek, and a lot of the disciplines were inspired by it. And so gymnastics develops out of that. Soccer, rugby, gridiron football, cricket, baseball, all those are developed, in that British boarding school system or the American equivalents of it, and really oriented towards the production of good members of the empire, right? And so there was this nationalistic meaning that was given to sport, which has collapsed. And that meaning maybe had some positives, also had some pretty strong negatives that we could potentially point out. But I also think it's collapsed and it's been replaced by a corporatism. And so it just strikes me all of a sudden that if you look at like the early flow sports, like snowboarding, like surfing, they're very much associated with a counterculture, which is a reactive pushback against.
Absolutely.
Yes. And it seems like parkour is like maybe the third generation of that's coming in with more of a potential for integration. It's not so reactive that it's just anti the system. It can actually be a discipline that's about looking at it a little bit more than just, we don't like that, we don't want to do it, but why did it become what it is, and how do we integrate something better going forward?
So in my thesis, there's a part that talks about a theme that came out, a process of almost cultish integration that came from practicing. So different people who experience practicing parkour. And just to note, what you were saying about it's so easy sometimes to, put our sport on the pedestal. And actually, I'm quite, I'd like to say critically analytical, but sometimes quite critical too, or quite cynical. And so I researched the costs of parkour, rather than the gains, because when my proposal came in, everything was about the benefits of parkour. So for me, it was actually the opposite that fascinated me. And one of the things was this real kind of sense of engulfment that can either feel very safe and motivating because you keep wanting to return, or very threatening because when you don't feel like you're fitting into the culture, you feel stress. To the point that sometimes you even just get too stressed that you don't want to go to classes because you're worried about how that's going to be. So there was this kind of duality that was really interesting. And actually, the thing that fascinated me was that the way that I've understood the history of how the discipline developed, whether it's David Bell or not, was really about what does this form of movement or search for movement or just use of body and self do for me. So it really had me at the center of it, whether that is because I want to be as strong as I can be physically, or whether that is because I want to give back to my community. It doesn't really matter. There was a me at the center of it, and then there was a kind of, okay, and what will the group give me, followed by then maybe I want to give back, or it will make me stronger on the path that I'm on, and it still stays quite me. It doesn't really matter. But it kind of also almost felt like, while I was researching, that organically, whenever you have a discipline that's a little bit rebellious in the sense that it challenges certain things, it can easily be almost easy, depending on what your own combat is with societal conformity, to hop on the bandwagon of being destructive.
Sure.
So, you know, whether that's with property or that's even with the expression of movement with itself, sometimes there's a real kind of look at me, or I can do this invincibility that came out in my thesis that is quite heroic. It's linked to, some people called it in my interviews, hedonism. And somehow it was a display of a rebelliousness that they had, that actually once they identified that they really wanted to address that, they went back to the community aspect of parkour.
Yeah.
And they actually went back to, actually, no, what I train brings people together. And it's actually more about me and how I've interpreted this training that has made me rebellious. So using it as a rebellion. And they were just going through this process, and they had said, they'd never discussed this before, but they kind of found that out as they were doing the interview with me, with no prompting from me, because obviously I was just collecting data at that time. And I thought it was fascinating because it made me realize that, like you said, compared to other sports that maybe did start with some kind of rebellion, the Yamaks that I met, and David Bell, from what I've seen, although they were doing the sport to get stronger, to try to figure something out for themselves, it wasn't in a way to push back on anything. It was trying to make things better. But in the way it looks, if that person has something rebellious that is happening within them, it can be adopted for the opposite. So its versatility was really fascinating to me, but also really interesting just on a national level of how easy it is for people to buy into this perception, as I said before, of parkour is dangerous. Parkour is an alternative sport. It's different. But I think it is those things, just without the connotation that often comes with it. Yeah.
So you triggered something interesting for me in the idea of the risks of parkour, or the negatives, the costs of membership, or of deciding to train. Because not just in parkour, but in all these sports that I hear people saying, you're going to get all of these benefits out of them. I have this question: how do we do that better? Or I look at people, like you said in your parkour journey, it changed the way that you felt in public spaces, that you gained confidence. You gained something that was really meaningful to you. And it feels like most, especially in the early days of parkour, most of the people, the leaders of the parkour community that I met, they could all tell you that parkour had changed them in some fundamental way. It changed their interaction with the world. And this was really powerful. And we just felt that, like, in the beginning for me, we felt that, like, if we just exposed people to parkour, they would get these changes and it would be awesome. And you didn't have to do anything other than have people jump off stuff and they'd get it. But as I see it now, I think that was naive, right? I think that just because you achieved a change from this jump, it doesn't mean that or from this discipline, doesn't mean there's anything unique to that discipline versus anything else that you could have tried. And it also doesn't mean that you're going to continue to accrue those beneficial changes if you keep doing the same thing. And it also doesn't mean that there aren't potential negatives. Right.
Yeah, and I think a few things that just stand out when you're saying it, actually, in relation to my own experience, but also what I now see when I'm teaching and when I'm planning workshops. The people who transmit are the people who, I feel, leave the change. The parkour itself, I'm not convinced it does anything more than instantly gratify an individual. Now, I know that's a really controversial statement, but because it's so imminent that the moment it stops working and it stops giving, the interpretation of what more is there to a jump, usually I've found comes from either the internal voice and the internal dialogue people have, or the community. So I think that there's also a transition in the transmission. There's been a change in the transmission as it explodes.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So, I mean, there's obviously, it was spread in France by a word of mouth and direct experience. And then it was spread in my generation through downloadable content. We had to go onto forums and talk to people and get them to share videos, and like go onto megaupload.com and like spend hours downloading videos. And then there was YouTube, right? Mm-hmm. Now there's, cinema quality videos being published every day, pretty much, with tons of parkour content. Like I found with myself, like a lot of times I can just watch parkour now and it doesn't even mean anything to me. It's just like, it's just pretty images flashing on a screen. So that's changed tremendously, right? And there's also like, there's transmission of positives. There's also the potential for transmission of negative. There's all these subcultures that have developed.
But I think that that's also really key to the person. So somebody watching it will be driven by their drivers.
Yeah.
Some of them will be unconscious. So sometimes when you see, and a lot of what I say, usually, I said this in the workshop I delivered today, it's obvious what I say, but it's amazing how we don't often pull it back into head when we're training or when we're doing other things, because it's so obvious we forget about it. And yet that's the thing with social media, how somebody internalizes what they're seeing is dependent on their own search that they may not even be aware of. So if they have a real need to gratify something or to resolve something, and it happens to be something that's going to make them even less happy with themselves in the long term, they're going to get that from that thing they see. And they're going to go to a teacher and say, I want you to teach me that thing. And the teacher may not ask why, they may teach it to them. And then they go and they end up doing something, I'm not even talking about injury, but just forming patterns with that training, where the training is feeding into something that maybe is really far removed from the kind of healthy, productive view we all hold of what this discipline can bring us. And I think that's why, I always say, what's your parkour? Because although I like to think I do know a little bit of the history and, I've tried to do my research, the people in front of me that I try to train with or I try to share with, they don't just get their parkour experience. They also get mine and I get theirs. And that's kind of stripped away with social media unless the thing that you're watching has process in it. And that's why I think with Esprit Concrete athletes, we try so hard that even if it bores some people, we try to get them to talk about the process behind their movement, because we don't want people to just see a backflip or just see a jump. We want them to see what happened to that individual. So if there is somebody sitting at home thinking, yeah, I want to do that because I'm going to feel awesome, they may also be like, okay, maybe in the end I'll feel awesome, but first I may spend a year feeling pretty crap. And what do I do with that if I still want my backflip?
That in our workshops, we've started doing a thing where after a certain amount of time, we'll stop and have people dialogue, right? So it's like, what did you get from that, right? And we'll give them questions to help them format and think about what the types of insights they might get out of it are. And then another big piece of that is that the story is their story, right? We share our story, we share our paradigm, but we always try to leave a level of agnosticism, right? So there's the parkour that is the, or the whatever evolve, move, play. There's the overarching story, and then there's the meaning that it has for each individual. And it's important to recognize that the overarching story can't completely, the individual stories can't completely collapse into the overarching story. If they do, then you're taking something away from the students that's very, very valuable. So that's really something that's very important to me, I think.
Yeah. And I think for us, it's really important, thinking about national governing bodies, it's really important for risk management. Yeah. Thinking just in terms of, at least for me, duty of care, how do we show people our paradigm out there? How do we set standards that, aren't boxing people in, but are keeping a format that more or less allows what we believe is healthy development, informed by ourselves, our members, the board, but also just research in general? How do we do that to minimize the negative impact of social media. Because if we think about the millions of views that we get in the UK of what's happening, getting to know why people join parkour, I think is quite important for us to mitigate risk. And so I don't think parkour is dangerous. I just think that people's perception of parkour and how they internalize it and what it can mean for them and what they envisage themselves doing within parkour or using parkour for, it's much more complicated than I think we give it credit for often.
Yeah.
So for example, a very concrete example is just if you are struggling, for example, with the parts of us that we all have, but not the healthy narcissism, but the narcissism that gets us in trouble or that keeps us away from people. Yeah, if we've got that knocking at the door a lot and we want to be self-gratified a lot and we want to, we fall into that trap of wanting to feel bigger, greater, grandiose than we are, parkour is great for that, especially if you're a natural mover.
Yeah.
And then maybe it distances you from the community and then you're isolated. And that kind of stuff can happen, in free training, but it can also happen in a club. And then there are costs to that. It could happen in a team if we ever do move to that level of sport or art. And that kind of stuff, I think we could potentially be ahead of the game for trying to mitigate it because it's so new. In one way, it's very old, but you know what I mean? It's new in the kind of hierarchical system of things.
Yeah. I wanted to dig into this question of the harms, right? A little bit more. I've noticed, to go back to the analogy of the jump, you do a jump and it challenges you to overcome fear, right? So you did that. Now you have some resource that you can call on to know what it's like to overcome fear, something that's embodied. That's really powerful. But then there's the transfer of training effect. Do you actually go to your life and when you need to ask for a raise with your boss or ask out a pretty girl or, have a difficult conversation with your partner, can you access that courage? And then I think that there's a trap. The trap is that sometimes when you're having that anxiety in the other places in your life, but you have this cultivated place where you can feel like a courageous person, it becomes the place where you hide from the things that you actually need to confront. So it's like all these things that we have, all these tools that we have, whether it's parkour or jiu-jitsu or, ballet dancing or meditation, it's useful to think of them as tools. And when they're integrated well, they can be very powerful, but they all also can be turned to negative purposes, right? I've seen people who are Vipassana practitioners who've completely turned off their emotions in a very negative way. And I've seen, some of the best parkour athletes in the States are people who are suffering suicidal levels of depression and abusing substances. And it's so interesting to think there's this promise that this practice can give you something. And yet I've seen people walk down very dark paths, maybe not because of the practice, but the practice didn't prevent it. And so I'm very curious, we're nearing the end of the time that we had allotted for this, but I'm curious for your take on how we can do this better, how we can recognize the shadow side of what we practice better and integrate the insights better. And what is some practical advice that you could give the people watching today to integrate their practice better?
The easiest thing that we try to do with our community, and I say the easiest because it's the easiest to say and it's the easiest for people to understand, and you don't need any other skills than just being a human being to do it. It's really train telling people what you think. And the reason why I say that is because it's a really scary thing to tell people what you think. It's really scary to tell them what you think about yourself. It's sometimes even scarier to tell them what you think about them. And part of training, at least for us, is the potential to not only get to know yourselves, but to get to know other people. So the risk of an individual going down a path, for example, like the one you described, it doesn't happen overnight. There are signs, just like any other sport or any other event, life event. In order to get to understand what that person's looking for, why are they switching off their emotions to be able to do that calm precision? Mm-hmm. It takes a simple conversation. It's just not simple because it requires a lot of courage. So I guess that the advice is try, in the same way that you would approach a jump and do all the progressions to try to make it. I think really trying to increase your communication and your bonding with the people that are around you training, it's a nice kind of self-regulatory thing that we can all do in the community, to just be a lot more open about what someone's training is and what it is not. And I think instead of us, getting trapped into this thing of idolizing the fact that, did you see how massive that calm precision was? Maybe just seeing, how did the person react when they did the calm precision? Did they seem gratified, or did they seem like it wasn't enough? Maybe just caring enough about the humanity part of that individual to see whether, once they can't jump anymore, are they still going to be happy? It doesn't take a psychologist to have those conversations. It kind of just takes a bit of curiosity in the other person, but really as a person, I think, and also a little bit of time. So when you're going to training, maybe being able to spend a few moments just talking to somebody about them. So often you do see great groups of people training, but they're actually just jumping together in the same space. They don't actually know each other. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think for me, knowing somebody also maybe takes on a different understanding because of what I do or what I allow myself to ask people, or I try my best not to force people to speak to me, but I kind of provide a floor to be like, I really am here to listen. And I think we can all do more of that. So if you see someone getting so frustrated with not being able to do something, just take a few minutes if you can to just ask them, but what's really getting at you? Because you seem really frustrated about not getting this one jump. What is it about the jump? What is it? To get to understand people's intentionality a bit more, because then you can safeguard. Like, safeguarding is all our duty, right? It's something we all need to do, or we should all want to do, just as human beings, keep ourselves safe.
Yeah.
And we have to do that, I think, in parkour, because the risk is high. The danger is not. The danger is not high. The danger is not high because the risk taking is what we manage. It's what we learn.
So the way that I frame this is, risk is how likely something is to fail, and danger is the consequences of the failure. So you kind of have.
Yes. Sorry. So the danger is really low.
Low if it's danger. Exactly. Is potentially high. Risk is very low if you do.
Yes, but the risk is high, and the danger is very low. There isn't the.
I would say it exactly.
The risk is high. No, the risk is low. But the danger is high. Yeah, I'm getting confused, but basically there's very little likelihood of the devastation happening. Otherwise, it would be happening more often.
Yeah.
But our ability to move towards that devastation, collectively, I think, if we just pay a bit more attention to the person moving, rather than just, wow, you've got really nice technique. Mm-hmm. That's it. Can you teach me how to jump like that? And then leaving.
What is the internal process? What's going on? Why are you doing it? Why am I doing it?
Yeah. And also just, is this a need or a want?
Yeah.
Same as if you think about alcohol.
I think about the idea of the call of the jump, right? There, the breaking the jump series, right? Do you feel the call? Have you assessed the jump? Have you processed your fear? Have you made your decision? Can you act? And sometimes I see a jump and it's like, I know that I'm physically capable of it. I have that sense of like being hooked to it, but I recognize that it's not really for me that day. It's not who I am that day. It's maybe a future me or a past me. It's someone else who's doing it in the scenario. It's very important to me to be like, no, I'm I'm fully aligned with taking this jump now. And safety always is about that deep integration of the self for me.
Yeah. But you've already reframed it differently. You've mentioned it as the call to the jump. Yeah. You've not said, I can do this jump, but I can't do it now. So for us, if you can't do it now, you can't do that jump now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's different to say, I really want this jump.
Yeah.
You know, and I'd love to have it now. But actually, maybe I can't have it now, but I can have this, this, and this. Or maybe somebody else volunteering, well, maybe you can't have the jump right now, but how about you do this, this, and this? And then normalizing the fact that what's the worst thing that would happen if you never had the jump?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's also scary for somebody who really, really wants the jump. Mm-hmm. And who also more and more now is going to want the jump to make money from it.
Mm-hmm. And prestige.
Yeah. And Instagram views.
Yeah. Dopamine. Yeah. I think that asking the question why is kind of maybe the theme of the conversation here. That what people need to do is think about that more deeply, and that's going to be, create processes to extract that, so they'll have a better integration of their practice.
Yeah. And I think just thinking about how, like what is happening, makes the why more apparent. Because sometimes we get stuck on the why because we miss out the how. And the how is probably easier to grasp than the why, because sometimes we never find out why.
That's true. Yeah, I have, I just published one of our solo podcasts, the why, what, how of Evolve, Move, Play. We've tried to really refine that down as a general model, as my model. So there's that. And then there's one other thing that popped into my head that I wanted to sort of share here, which is, when you're talking about talking to people, right? That's something that's very interesting, because that's something that's come out of our workshops, because we teach, I think the group class format or the group get together format where it's brief has major limitations. And when we've gone to these long retreats where we have 4 and 8 day long retreats, it facilitates the communication around the process in a much deeper way. And it creates this sense of meaningful experience and connection where people have friendships and safety to start exploring who they are and what they're motivated by in a very different way. And it's interesting because just last night I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the conversations that I can have with the students and with the group of people who've come through that, and the fear and inhibition that I had to have those same kinds of conversations when I was first in my practice, right? Mm-hmm. So, there are people, for instance, who I really was hoping that I would get to practice with more often, and it didn't happen. And the sense that if I actually just asked them why that wasn't happening, it would be acknowledging some insufficiency in myself that was very threatening, right? To say that I would really appreciate it if you would just come and train with me felt like a major blow to my ego, I think, at that time, to be that vulnerable with the people in my community who I was training with. And so it just struck me as something that is worth recognizing for people, that saying talk to people, yes, but also recognize that it carries that need for courage and vulnerability can be an extremely courageous act.
Absolutely. And the people around you who are not training with you can also help point that out, that maybe more generally that vulnerability has come up before.
Yeah.
And if it has, then it's something that you're going to, or you have worked on, but we can't see our own vulnerabilities often. None of us can. I mean, I have my own therapist, I have supervision, I have people around me to make sure I can deliver the best practice, but also I can be someone I'm happy with. So, I think it does take huge amounts of courage, but in that fundamental concept, of this discipline, you're not alone. You don't have to be alone. If you're choosing to be alone, it may be because it's tough not to be alone. And maybe there are skills there that need to be groomed, but perhaps there's 1 or 2 people that you could trust to help point out when the habits resurface of pulling back, of avoiding, of staying to yourself. And slowly but surely, they can take that risk with you. You know, it's a little bit like spotting. You just give them a bit of autonomy for a little bit, and then you take it back. And it doesn't have to be only in a movement context. Because there were people maybe who would have noticed that you were shying away from things, maybe with the way that you said things or the questions that you asked. And perhaps they were also too scared to bring it up. And, you know, that's just the example, you know, that you gave. But just in general, if we see it more as a collective responsibility to make sure that everyone's growing the way they want to grow, then maybe we don't feel so alone all the time. Otherwise, it's a lot to shoulder, you know, even for yourself, having that courage to speak up for yourself. Sometimes, yes, we need to learn that, but at the same time, we also need to learn how to allow others to help us, and others need to step up together, I think.
Sometimes it's hard.
Absolutely.
But
it's a lifelong movement.
Yeah. But this almost feels like a call for the you know, I'm saying the movement practice, but really this could be for any community. But it's a call for taking up a kind of a burden of emotional courage, or a duty of emotional courage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why, you know, I think the duty to care for yourself and others, if we all have it as our own, then when we have the capacity, we can do our bit. And when we don't, hopefully somebody else will do their bit.
It isn't. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was going to say, you know, often people who know me, you know, laugh at me and say, you know, you're so utopic, you've got this hope. But I kind of feel like that's what makes me work on what I'm working on. And that's what, you know, allows me to kind of face disappointment when there is, because it's not delusional hope. It's just sort of like, I know the reality is different, but I also know that if we don't hope for a different reality for tomorrow, then we're not going to target our actions in that direction either. We're sort of just going to sit with this idea that everything is crap. And for me, that kind of keeps us quite stagnant. Or we're going to talk a lot about what we're going to do. And then when it comes to really sweating it out before you take that brave step, you may not be able to do that. But I've seen people spend 10 years trying to take that step and then take it. Mm-hmm. To me, that's been worth it for them. That's been worth it for me. But it took them 10 years. So what? Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I always say with people's progress, you know, people often will say, you know, how can I progress faster? How can I do this? And I'll be like, if you're having progress, be thankful. Start with gratitude for the fact that there's progress, because it's not always going to be there. Sometimes you'll struggle. Sometimes you'll regress. And so in my own practice, it's like I try not to be too greedy. If it's going in the right direction, I don't need to necessarily take it that much faster.
Yeah. And in response to that question, I would really ask them, how are you defining progress?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good place to sum it up. A call for emotional courage.
Yes, we all need some.
I guess I wanted to say, I think it's interesting that you draw this distinction between the culture or the way that was cultivated with ADD and what came out of parkour, as more tribal oriented versus more individually oriented. And you know, like several times through the course of the conversation, I just had the phrase in the back of my mind echoing, you know, we start together, we finish together. And
I think, you know, that there's something to be said definitely with that I strongly believe in parkour community. I believe that parkour community is a thing. So like in my mind, there's Esprit Deplacement, there's free running and parkour, there's parkour community. My understanding of David Bell's parkour is very different to the parkour practice today. Yeah. And I think that that's just because the community innately, organically needs connection. They thrive on connection. They want that connectivity. It kind of takes them back to the tribal need, the in-group need, you know, and that's, I think, what brings about that be stronger together. But for me, that phrase had always kind of been awakened in me when I was with the Yamak. Mm-hmm. It wasn't necessarily when I was in a parkour class. that's just my experience.
Yeah.
But when I was free training in the community, then I felt like I was back with the ADD community. And the reason I call it the ADD community is because the other guys don't call themselves that. So the ADD community for me are the people who say I practice art du déplacement, whereas the parkour community are the people who say I do parkour.
Yeah.
But for me, I found that people were doing parkour and I was like, but you're actually also doing ADD. And it was that thing of like, okay, so when did that start? And that's why for me, I made the difference between, okay, I think parkour, the way I hear the founders speak about it, because I can't access David, it sounds like it had maybe a different meaning or significance for him, just as him.
Yeah.
But then the community took up a similar meaning to what the Yamakasi have somehow, and then it got confusing.
I think that you had the split, and then you had the jump where it jumped to all these other communities, and then you have this self-organization of different energies, different values coming through, and then someone like Stefan is David's student, but then he goes and trains with William and he picks up some of that culture, and then he comes to the UK and starts Parkour Generations, and Blaine goes and trains with folks in France. And so there's lots of these interesting connections between the community.
I should say that most of this, what I've just said, and this kind of vision, it changed the most at 2 Every Move events ago, because that's when Stefan went back.
Interesting.
Also, and we were all privy to their discussions, and obviously if you speak French then it was even easier, but that's when I got to know a lot more about the history, but even from Stefan's point of view, and really seeing the emotion of what it meant for him to be there, and how different that was for him to be either by himself or with his past, with David. And there was no judgment on it. It really was just a pure, there is a difference here. And what is that difference? And hearing them talk about it made me kind of reinforce what I thought initially of like, oh, so there is a difference, and there's a difference even for people who started with David. And I think that's when I realized that's what I've been sensing, because and I traveled quite a lot to try and find what I was looking for in terms of that community origin, the tribal origin you were talking about, the sense of family, the belonging, without even knowing that was what I was looking for. But I reached out, and well, now they actually are like my second family, and it's awesome, and Esprit Concrete wouldn't exist without them. But yeah, I think there's a difference. I just think it depends what you're looking for, and your reality of it will depend on your interpretation of it. But some of what I believe does come from their storytelling of their life. So I feel like, just to not.
Sorry, you broke up there for a second. Just to not.
Just to reiterate, obviously, that I haven't spoken to David Bell. This comes from, hearing Stefan Vigru, speaking a bit to Thomas, the 4 Yamaks that I mentioned, Malik. The forums at Every Move are very nice to learn about the history as well. When they go on their tours in Lease, and, they actually tell the stories, the childhood stories. Me and David did this here, and then they're very open in sharing that history now compared to when I first met them 5 years ago, for a various number of reasons. But if anyone wants to know about them, I would strongly suggest going to Every Move and finding out.
It's interesting. I feel like we've been focusing on the importance and the value of the tribal aspect, and I think I wouldn't want people to get the impression that what David was building wasn't also important, because there is the importance of building yourself as an individual. But
I think what you said at the beginning does that, because each of them are different. So when you get taught by Laurent, and then you get taught by Jan, and then you get taught by Xiao and Williams, you almost get a sense, in my opinion, I get a sense that they don't work just on their own. They form a piece of a puzzle. So that individuality that each person brought, and I'm presuming David as well, it's really an individual in a tribe. rather than you just buy into a tribe.
Yeah, you need both. You need that.
You
Like
definitely need both.
my own practice,
Absolutely.
that if I don't train on my own occasionally, there's something missing. That there's a deep
100%.
that is necessary.
Yes. And there's a section on the recommendation side, so it's called the contained practitioner model, in my thesis, that talks about the importance of even how that grows play and autonomy and creativity, that you need a balance between in-group and solo. So yeah, no, totally agree.
Beautiful. Well, I definitely think we should we need to wrap up, but I'm sure you and I could go on talking for a long time, and I hope lots more conversations.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity, and obviously shout out to Cordelia. She's the one who suggested it, because that's really lovely to get a chance to meet someone new, but also have these kind of conversations. It's one of the beauties of internet.
Yeah. Cordelia Bickford is coaching program director at Parkour Visions right now, I believe. She's the one who recommended that we speak. So yes, thank you to Cordelia. And thank you, Kasturi.
Thank you, Rafe.
Thanks for listening to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. If you want to support what we're doing, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notifications button so you know what's coming up. And of course, the biggest support you can give is to become a Patreon supporter. This is what's going to allow us to grow this platform more than anything else. So this is entirely listener supported, and we really appreciate your support. And we look forward to talking to you again soon.